The increased role of money in politics is playing a role, because what candidate's going to have an easier time fundraising? Well, probably one that is able to appeal to, the research finding sometimes the more ideologically extreme ones.
Professor Kettler, how are you?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm excited to talk to you today. You are a professor of political science at Boise State. Wow, we are in a crazy time of politics in the state of Idaho.
I mean, not just Idaho, the country as well. Let's just say my job is never boring.
Okay. I think we're in a crazy time of political theater in the country, but I don't think we're in a crazy time of politics per se nationally as much as we are here, because things that are happening here are really affecting us locally here, right? Like, I don't know the last bill or thing that got passed in our dysfunctional federal government that I'm like, well, that affected me. Like, I get affected by interest rates that the Fed does, but they're not related to the federal. They're just called the Fed, sure. Right? So, like, we were just talking beforehand. You had an experience that was very much related to Idaho law and legislation that had a meaningful impact in your immediate life. Mm-hmm. Tell me that.
Sure. Well, a little background. I teach state politics, study state politics. I thought I wanted to go to law school, but then did an internship in the Kansas Senate in college and just loved it and was like, whoa, this is fascinating. So for years, right, just fascinated by state politics. And one of the classes I teach at Boise State is comparative state politics. And I talk a lot with my students about how much state policy and politics impacts their daily lives. Because as you were saying, Matt, there's so much attention to what happens in DC, but so much of what happens at the state and local levels, what affects our daily lives. And we can see over the past few years, a lot of policies that are directly influencing our lives in different ways. Excuse me. The allergy season.
Yeah, right. I've been coughing like crazy. I was a little worried that it was like the cloud seeding. Just kidding. It's not cloud seeding. They only do that in the winter.
So last year I was teaching state politics as usual in the spring, so we can follow the legislature as it goes along. But I was also pregnant. And I was a high-risk pregnancy due to my age, my medical history. I'm a cancer survivor, and I have high blood pressure. So I hit a lot of those marks as a higher risk pregnancy. And so I was seeing the maternal fetal medicine doctors here in town. And I had my first doctor leave the state due to the state abortion laws. And then also other doctors continued to leave the practice or the office throughout my time there. By the end, I was seeing, they had brought in a doctor for a temporary time. And thankfully, things turned out at the end all right. And I got wonderful care, but it was really, it was disruptive for that process when you're seeing one doctor and then you read in the paper that they're leaving the state because they can't do their job. And so it was just this really fascinating situation of where I'm like teaching class, right, and telling my students, like, I'm not joking when I say these things affect your daily life. Like right now, I'm experiencing some of the effects of these recent policies in Idaho.
And again, you were not somebody who was looking to terminate, like you were trying to build a family, and the policies that went into place that, and again, I'm not making comment on whether or not we should have them. And if it's what Idahoans want, then it's what Idahoans want. But the policies that were intended to prevent, for instance, elective abortions, fine. Those policies were affecting somebody who was trying to get to term and deliver a baby.
Right. And so, yeah, we had been trying for a very long time to have a baby. So yes, it's very, very much wanted. And it was increasingly clear that regardless of the situation, people were going to be having a difficult time to get the care they needed. And this has just continued to get worse since, in terms of that medical care. And, again, like, it's a scary time, like when you're pregnant, even with a really desired pregnancy, like what's going to happen, what's going on. And when you already have medical complications, it was just one of those things that was I later had people ask me, did you have a plan? Like, what would happen if you had, if you needed something? I'm like, thankfully we have resources, and we're in Boise. Like we had support, we had resources, but we can increasingly see where it's a problem for a variety of people. And increasingly, more and more of the population is going to know someone that needs care and isn't able to get it, or has to travel really far to deliver a baby or things like that.
That's wild. Aside from that, because I didn't even know that until I met you this morning, and I think it's so interesting that we do have access in Idaho. We do have access to our legislators to a degree that I never thought would be possible. Like, you can call reps, like you can email them. One I called about a year and a half ago, back when the podcast was still really growing and like nobody knew about it. I called this person and she picked up her phone, and it was her cell phone listed on the website with her picture, like the State House website. I'm like, hello? She's like, hi, this is so-and-so. Like, who are you? I'm like, oh, I'm a person. I'm not even one of your constituents. I was just wondering if you'd like to come and do a podcast. She was like, yeah, sure. Like, send me the links, and I appreciate that. But I also find that people are, the way people are engaging with politics in general is not to pick up the phone and call. Right. The way people are engaging in politics is like persuasion through proxy, right? Like we're getting more frustrated in and collecting in certain frustrated groups, and making a lot of noise instead of calling people, we make noise on Facebook groups or Nextdoor or things of this nature. And we're persuading people through kind of like mob pressures. Are you seeing that same thing, or is that just me, making a random observation that's not accurate?
No, I think that does reflect a lot of what we're seeing in different ways. And I agree. The accessibility of our policymakers in Idaho is really quite impressive. Now, I tell my students, not every single legislator or policymaker is going to be, yes, let's have a chat, but a lot of them will pick up the phone or answer your email or have coffee and chat about whatever you're interested in, which is really interesting. And a lot of people in other states don't have that access. And I do really appreciate that we are able to engage with our policymakers in this way. That being said, there's also questions on, okay, well, we have this access, and many of our policymakers seem like, nice people to interact with, perhaps. But are we, what's that translating to? Are we seeing the work get done that we want to see done? Or are we seeing a lot of attention to things like social issues that perhaps the folks that are getting really angry online are really pushing for, but a lot of Idahoans, maybe that's not their top priority.
Hiram Erickson, who came in to do a Prop 1 conversation, he was pro Prop 1. He's a Republican from Rexburg, and he's actually precinct committeeman. And he's pro Prop 1. One of his points was that you have these social issues that have just absolutely dominated people's headspace and dominated the legislative sessions and taken all this energy, and then other people aren't getting things done, excuse me, or aren't able to have their voices heard. And that's leading to citizen initiatives like Prop 1. Do you think that's an accurate reflection of what's actually going on? That like the citizen initiative is being brought to bear because we focus so much on other things and citizens don't feel that the legislature is doing their job?
That is one thing that research finds, and only about half the states have direct ballot initiatives like we have here in Idaho, but that researchers find in a lot of states, they do seem to be used as a way to get around government gridlock, whether that's gridlock at the national level or at the state level, where maybe it's not really gridlock, but the legislature is not really taking action on the policy that citizens want. And so there's the argument that initiatives may provide a way to basically put pressure on the legislature a little bit, or circumvent the legislature to pass policies that citizens really want. And so it can kind of provide this more direct way for citizens to enact policy in line with what their preferences or needs are.
This is as close as we get to direct democracy, right? Like, and that has inherent risks. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of risk that we can have. And of course, in a state like Idaho, we have a lot of restrictions, or like it's more challenging to get an initiative on the ballot, right? It's not as easy as say in California, where it's much easier to get an initiative on the ballot. But
is it easier? I'm sorry. I was not engaged in politics in California.
Yeah. So in Idaho, you have to have, in order to qualify for the ballot, an initiative needs signatures of at least 6% of registered voters in at least 18 legislative districts across the state. So you can't just have all the people in Boise sign an initiative. So that's a couple, that makes it more challenging in terms of registered voters being used to that threshold, and then that geographic diversity piece. Some states it's just like blanket, like how many signatures, and it can just be that's not tied to things like registered voters. So in states like California, Oregon, Washington, we see a lot more ballot initiatives. When you see a lot more initiatives, sometimes you even have conflicting measures on the same ballot, which is like, okay, well, then what happens there? Usually the one that receives the most votes is the one that will actually be enacted if all of them pass, which is, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting way to.
Oh, so you could have literally what, like, I think one initiative was an interpretation of what marriage means in California, right, years back. And so you're saying there could be two different definitions of or ballots having to do with that, and they could both pass, and then whichever one gets the most votes, even though they both pass.
Yeah.
God, how great is that? Like, what a train wreck of a system.
I know. My students are always like, wait, what? Yeah. Because sometimes what's happened, I know in like California, there'll be a bunch of like competing insurance related measures or things like that. Or maybe they're not competing, but slightly different ways to do the same thing. So we have that component. Sometimes unconstitutional things can pass through the initiative process. So then there's going to be court cases and costs involved with figuring that out, right? And sometimes as well, they can actually create fiscal issues if they're like locking in, tax rates or, doing different things or requiring super majorities for budget stuff or whatever might be the case. Sometimes we end up seeing then later on budget issues related to those measures.
Right. I mean, or if I could envision something like a statewide rent control. That's, a citizen initiative. And it's like, okay, I'm not going to say that's not a good idea. I don't think that's a good idea, but that's just me. I'm sure somebody would like it.
But well, yeah. And so like we can pass really impactful legislation or like policies through the initiative process and pass it into statute. And so they can, and not only could they create budget issues for how they like structure the budget process, but it could also cost a lot of money, and sometimes cost a lot more money than what might be expected or what proponents of the initiative might think.
I had a gal on by the name of Jaci Kettler, who's the CEO of the Idaho Medical Association. And she was talking about the results after the trigger law went into effect after Roe versus Wade was repealed. And I put a couple clips on, and people, obviously, it's a very charged topic, and I 100% understand why. And people got upset. Just that I was talking about it, people got upset. Now, I'm not coming at it from this is right or this is wrong. I was literally just asking what the fallout was. And my position is, look, it's essentially like informed consent, right? Like if the residents of Idaho know that there will be a fallout in the medical establishment if they enact certain laws, they should be allowed still. Like you shouldn't, be saving, quote unquote, saving people from themselves. I don't like that idea. I think that's a really bad precedent to set. And you see this a lot with legislation in different states about child-parent relationships. So like, well, we can't tell the parent these things because it might lead to a bad outcome with the kid. It's like, okay, but we have established protocol if you know that the parent is really mad and perhaps abusing a kid, then you call CPS. Like you don't preemptively, withhold information. I don't like the idea of preemptively saving people from themselves or something like that. That's kind of what the citizen-led initiatives are, which is, hey, even if this leads to something bad, we still give people the ability to do that, or what somebody would consider as a bad outcome. We still give people the ability to do that. that's not really how our government was set up, though, right? Like, we don't have direct democracy for this reason. So, like, what's the balance here where we allow for a pressure relief valve, so to speak, where the citizenry feels that, hey, there's gridlock, or they're not representing us, or like you're just not doing your job, and hey, the direct democracy is a problem, and that's why we don't have a direct democracy. Like, where's the balance here, and how do we navigate this and allow people to get exactly what they want from their government and from their laws, but also have checks and balances that were established by our original founding fathers?
Well, if you solve that problem, I think that you will like win all the prizes and awards, right? Because
you're the professor. This is why you're here. You're supposed to give me the answers.
I don't have answers. I just have the ability to ask more questions, right? No, I think this is exactly one of the key debates we have. And you're right. Like, we don't have a pure direct democracy because of concerns on tyranny of the majority and what can happen, right, if you don't have some of these checks. But what we saw is the progressive movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We're like, hold on. Politicians are way too powerful. The parties are way too powerful. We need a way to provide more power to citizens, bring more power to the people, put more of a check on these office holders that are just kind of doing whatever they want.
Wait, did you say the late 1800s, early 1900s?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, wait, listen, I'm an idiot. You're going to have to help me here. Okay, what was happening in the late 1800s where you had parties that were like incredibly powerful? Like, what's the historical background of like overly competent and successful interest groups gaining power over the government?
Well, I don't know that they were necessarily, I mean, it depends on competent and successful. It would depend on your definitions, because at this time, like, state governments were not very competent. But what happened in a lot of places, we had what were referred to as party machines. And so in some urban areas, some rural areas even, one party dominated so much through things like patronage, where they would give their supporters jobs. And then they had pressure to make sure that their voters or that individuals kept supporting them. And we didn't have secret ballots in some of these places, so the party bosses could like make sure you were voting the right way. And so for a variety of these reasons, I mean, basically there was a lot of corruption in like the Gilded Age, and these parties were not turning over. There wasn't enough check on them. And so they were serving their own interest, right? These party machines and party bosses. And so the progressive movement, like the historic progressive movement, really wanted to push back against the parties and provide more power to individuals. And they did so through a few different reforms, one of which was primary reform. So having more direct primaries, taking that nomination process away from the parties where they could. Term limits was another thing progressives really supported, as well as the ballot initiative process, so that citizens had that direct way to consider and vote on policy.
God, that's wild. So they were doing this in the late 1800s.
Yeah. And so, I mean, a lot of these reforms were passed in the early 1900s, and the West particularly was where the progressives were really successful in enacting or passing a lot of these reforms. Term limits were a little more limited in success. We see a lot of those come back around in the late 1900s and early 2000s.
You mentioned historic or like the original progressive movement, because progressive means something totally different now. I mean, so does Democratic versus Republican Party. These are wild things. I mean, I don't know if you've followed anything that RFK has done or his support of Trump, and just the wild ride that even Tulsi Gabbard, which I find to be an incredibly compelling politician, obviously a vet, like she checks all the boxes, like very intelligent, the whole bit. And these people are leaving the classic blue collar, we're progressive, we're going to give power to the people. That was the classic Democratic slogan, which is like, we're going to fight for unions, we're going to fight for the little guy, all these things. And now they're like, no, we're going to fight for Meta, and we're going to fight for, the other tech companies, and we're going to fight for pharmaceutical companies, and, little guy be damned. How did that happen? Right? Like, how did the word progressive go from early 1900s, hey, these mass machines are too powerful, we need to bring power back to the people, to the people are really just a function of these machines?
Well, and I'm sure people who identify as progressive today would disagree with your characterization
Sure.
of the progressive movement and kind of the alignment. And I think there is some through lines of like populism, those kind of populist messages that we can see throughout. But and I talk about this a lot with my students. We use the same terms to mean different things, right?
Oh, sure. Conservative. The word conservative in Idaho, like you don't, I keep telling people this, you have no capacity when you're moving from a state like California to understand what conservative means in Idaho. Like you do not understand the range, like the 150 shades of conservative in Idaho. You have the guy who lives all the way on the mountaintop with, his homestead and his guns and he's part of a militia, all the way down to the person with purple hair, face tattoos and piercings who also claims to be very conservative. And you're like, these words do not mean the same thing to these. And there's like, the other 148 different shades in between those people. Let me rephrase my question because I agree with you. People that feel progressive and feel that's the right thing to do would probably not agree with my characterization. I have experienced things that seem so nonsensical and crazy to me. Like, hey, if somebody steals $900 or fewer of merchandise from a store, we should not arrest that person. We should give them a ticket. Okay. Or, hey, if you're a 12-year-old or older and you go to public school, we will transport you to reproductive health clinic. You can get whatever treatment you want. We will not tell your parents and we'll take you back to school. Like there are these types of laws that were passed or policies that were passed under the progressive banner that people, by the way, some people very much defend. Where it's like, how did we come to this point in politics? Like, how did we come to this point in just whatever? I mean, these are things getting passed by the same group or theoretical umbrella of people that were like, hey, let's bring power back to the people. Now it's like, let's take all the power away.
Yeah, and I think that's, where over time, kind of positions or orientations can shift. And, that progressive movement, that historic progressive movement really focused a lot on like government reforms, things like that. Now there's, we see these things change over time. I mean, we've seen changes within both parties on the issues, on some of the issues they stand for, right? And realignment of issues and over time. So things shift, right? It's just, we see it happen. Sometimes it happens quickly. Sometimes it takes more time. But I mean, I'm teaching a women in politics class this semester, and a lot of my students are often surprised to know that historically Republican voters were more liberal on almost every way you could ask about abortion rights until you start getting into like the 70s and 80s. And then you start to see this realignment, partially because you had a lot of very, Catholics in the Democratic Party, things like that, who are much more anti-abortion. But so like right over time, we saw this realignment of this issue where not, you don't have to go that far back to where the parties were differently aligned on it. Or at least voters were not, the parties were not, like there was more mixture within each parties on the positions of the issue.
I have seen a very odd, an odd situation kind of pop up or an observation that I'd love to ask you to consider or make comment on. Just the nature of progressive, like we're going to move forward. And the idea there is we need to keep going in a direction. We need to keep going forward. Boom, boom, boom. And that's generally like, Democrat, right? And then on Republican, conservative. Conservative is a position. We need to conserve. We need to say, this is our space. This is where we want to hit. This is it. So on one side, you have a direction where people are moving. And the other side, you have people that are trying to get back to a specific position. I've had a lot of people, political people, obviously, over my time doing this, talk about, hey, look, core values of the Republican Party are personal liberty, limited government, fiscal responsibility, that's their position. They're like, we need to conserve these things, right? Autonomy, independence, this whole thing. That's their position. And the progressives, right, especially some from my former state, don't have a position per se. They're just moving in a direction. And they continue moving in that direction. It's because of the nature of the slogan, progression, right? We're moving. We don't have a target other than forward momentum in this direction. And I have thought recently, it's like maybe this is why things are getting so out of whack in quote unquote progressive states, because the needle continues to move regardless of what position you're in. We're going to go harder and harder and harder and farther and farther and farther. It's never like, oh, no, we hit our destination, like we're good. And places that are classically more conservative are pushing harder and harder towards a specific end, right? And that could be, less government, less money, like personal, whatever it might be. But there is a very specific position they're trying to get to. Do you think that may be playing into the exaggerated positions that you see conservative versus progressive states hitting?
Sure. And in research, we find that really the Democratic Party and Republican Party, in a very general sense, meaning just in a broad, broadly, are different. They operate very differently. The Republicans are organized around ideological positions. The Democrats are more aligned on it's a group of social coalitions, right? And that's very different for operating compared to if you have a tighter kind of ideological alignment, those policy goals that you can organize around, kind of move forward on, as opposed to where you're trying to keep your coalition of groups together, where then there may be some questions on, okay, well, what exactly are the priorities? Or it may also be an approach of, well, we need to do a lot of different things to keep everyone happy and on board. That's a little less coherent than what you have on the Republican side. And there are benefits and disadvantages to either approach, and both parties have different struggles, right, in terms of how they operate and things like that. But I do find it really interesting that in a lot of kind of different ways we can conceptualize or measure parties, that in the very kind of more broadly, the parties seem to have at the core be different in that way.
Okay. I have never heard somebody articulate it that way. So essentially what you're saying is the Republican Party in general kind of revolves around ideology.
That conservative ideology.
So that idea, it's like X marks the spot for them, is accurate.
And they do vary in terms of that, that exact position. And so then we do see contested primary races that are often like about fairly narrow differences, but are quite intense ideological debates.
And then on the other side, you have an umbrella that's holding large groups of moving bodies, and that umbrella having to contain all of those large groups. When those large groups individually start moving one way or another, that the umbrella of the Democratic Party has to shift with them to keep them not captured, but keep them enveloped in the Democratic umbrella. So you have large groups of whatever specific interest group, could be, whatever, you name it, it doesn't matter. But you have large groups that are shifting farther left or shifting in a different direction. And the party has to. And
some aren't even that liberal, but yet they're like, think about Black voters. And, there's research diving into that. Many Black voters are not especially liberal, like some are, but there's a lot of diversity there. But they're within that Democratic, umbrella. And so you have some groups that are really liberal, some that may be more mixed ideologically, and then trying to find policies and priorities that are going to keep everyone together and get them to turn out to vote and support the party.
So is that why or is that at least one of the factors that seems to be driving the Democratic Party in a way that it's like, wait, why is it doing this? Like, who wants this? And it's at its core, it's that it's being driven by individual interest groups within the party.
And I think that makes it difficult at times to decide, okay, well, what are we going to prioritize? What sorts of positions will appeal to most of the voters? And, I think we do know that the parties are becoming at the national level more ideologically distant. So that does suggest that a lot of Democratic supporters are more on the left side. But again, trying to find policies that, okay, this is going to keep everyone happy and everyone on board. And maybe one approach is to kind of have policy positions that are going to appeal to each kind of group separately, things like that.
When you talk about keeping people happy, there's an ideology that's coming to the forefront, at least it's my understanding, that reflects less compromise and less bridge building as being a better thing. Talk to me about that.
Well, one thing we've seen, and we talk about polarization in our politics a lot, and there's actually debate on how polarized at the individual level we actually are. Are all of us like actually this divided? But we do know in the aggregate, we do see things like negative partisanship, where we tend to be really motivated by our dislike of the other side, the other party, rather than necessarily really excited about our own party. We really don't want the other party to win. And as a result, there's some increasing findings that individuals and voters may not actually be supportive of bipartisan compromise because they want their party to win and the other party to lose. Basically, we're rooting for a team, right? We want our team to win. We want their team to lose.
But there's also, hey, look, I want to win and I don't want them to win. But there's also the aspect of I can't remember the German word for it, but the English slang is hater, right? Like you're a hater. You actually get joy out of someone else's pain and demise, right? Even if you're not directly winning, because it's very easy to say like, hey, I'm happy I won. It's binary. I win, they lose. But there's an aspect of, I'm happy that I may not even be benefiting. They're just suffering.
Right.
Like where does that fit into this?
Right. And I think this is where people do raise concerns on how we engage in politics, but also like how our political elites, like, you know, how their rhetoric, those types of things, and if that inflames some of this type of behavior in terms of just really cheering for the other side to not do well, things like that. And again, there's debate in the research in terms of at the individual level, how divided are we? Are we behaving in this way? But we do know that there are some of these trends that can result in some nastiness in our politics at times.
Do you think that we're actually really divided? And what I mean by that is, like, of course that seems ridiculous to say, but like at the end of the day, say you and I are on opposite political spectrums, right? Or opposite end of the political spectrum, rather. We still want our kids to be healthy. We still want gainful employment. We want life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. We want those things. So we're not really divided on like, where's the finish line, right? Like we're divided on how we get there. Theoretically, we're divided on our obligations to the rest of the community in pursuit of our own individual things, right? Like one of the great things that I think is dividing both parties is what are our obligations to the other, right? Like not my family, not my neighbor, like, or maybe my neighbor, but like, what are my obligations outside of my household? And they're, one party saying, hey, I have no obligations outside of my own personal household. And the other party saying, theoretically, we have obligations to a lot of people that we don't know and may not even be citizens of the United States.
I think you're exactly right. And that at the individual level, we may not be as divided as like the headlines often say, right? And there are researchers that really push back against it as well, because as you were saying, a lot of people share the same policy priorities. Yes, they may differ on the solutions to them, but they're concerned about the economy. They're concerned about their children. And that a lot of people, I mean, that, there's variation, but in general, still are engaging with people from a variety of viewpoints. But at the same time, we have this geographic polarization where more and more of us live in areas surrounded by people that agree with us rather than have different points of view. So we have a lot of trends happening simultaneously, which at least from the research point of view makes things a little difficult to really sort them out. But I agree. I think that there are a lot of people who actually do want to engage, want to have conversations, and maybe don't always have the opportunity to do so, but aren't actively going around hating everyone of the other side. But there are also these partisan or ideological stereotypes that exist, right? That people use to really classify, oh, now that I know that you support Trump, blah, 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 blah. Oh, now that I know that you support Harris, blah, 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 blah. And so we've got some of these, there's a few challenging things happening in our politics, I think, perhaps not helped by how we engage on social media. But I agree that I do think there's more common ground than is generally discussed.
The utilization of the concept of the other, right? That is very effective at separating people from any kind of humanization or relation to varying viewpoints is being used so wildly. Like I saw a thing today that it was, oh man, I'll pop it up on the screen, but it's so fantastic. I actually took a screenshot of it. And again, let me be clear. I'm not for or against Prop 1. That's not my place at all. But I saw this thing online that has, check this out. It has the hammer and sickle. Okay. And it says they have open borders, they want open bathrooms, and they need open primaries. And it's a thing against Prop 1. Now, like, that's fine. People can have their opinions. But what I find very interesting is you got a lot going on in that. You have like the Soviet Union hammer and sickle. It's like, okay, got it. They have open borders, or whatever they're saying about open borders. And it's like the bathrooms. And then, they want the open primaries. What I find interesting is all the people I've spoken with about open primaries. I've done 2 interviews for and 2 interviews against. I have more coming out for and against, as well as a debate. All of these people for and against are all Republicans. They're all like, I don't think a single one of them wants unisex bathrooms in elementary schools and high schools. Like not a single one of them wants open borders. There are plenty of people that I've talked to that are conservative. Hiram Erickson was one of them. He's from Rexburg. He's a Republican precinct committeeman. He is an attorney. He is for open primaries for very specific reasons. And it's like the desire to say like, no, only like other people. Like if you want open primaries, you're like, you're not one of us. You couldn't possibly be one of us. You're like the other, right? And you're obviously aligned with the Soviet Union. It's like, wow, there's like, is there any obligation to saying, hey, look, yeah, like I'm Matt, you're Steve. Like we just disagree. That's totally fine. But you're a valuable contributor of our community. I'm a valuable contributor. Like where have we gone with that? Like, I don't understand how that went out the window.
I mean, yeah, I think that's a great point. But we also know like why we see signs or imagery like this, right? We know that fear can be really effective in terms of that's a sort of emotion that you get people fearful, and they're going to be like, that can really influence maybe them to turn out to vote against it, things like that. So it's an effective emotion to try to tap into.
They hit Russia, the border, and bathrooms all in one image. I was like, damn, whoever did that nailed that one. Like you really wrapped it all in.
Well, they're probably like, what are a lot of Idahoans afraid of?
I guess Russia, open borders, and bathrooms.
And I mean, we've seen different proposals, try to make the connections in a very broad sense, right? And so we can see why people in campaigns use these types of approaches, right? But to your point, for most people, yeah, they're like, well, what? Like, I thought we were voting on our, like, how we run our elections.
Right.
Like, what, just tell me, like, what might be the effect of this? What would change for me as a voter? Things like that.
Right. And so interesting because I do find, excuse me, the people I've spoken with that are against Prop 1 seem very reasonable. It's like, okay, I understand your position. You have a very clear position. I don't think it's a silly position. I think it's a position to be considered by all people. The people for Prop 1, I'm like, okay, that's a position. I don't think it's a silly position. Definitely should be considered. We have enough very clearly to make cases for both sides without the hammer and sickle, right?
Right. There are really interesting and nuanced arguments for both for and against it, right? And I do think we do voters we do them a disservice sometimes by suggesting that they don't want to dig into those arguments, or not capable of digging into those arguments. And instead we just need to let's just go to this outlandish sort of connection on whatever way it might be. But again, what's going to get attention? What are people going to remember? They're going to remember that sign. They're not necessarily going to remember this really interesting debate about the proper role of parties in our elections or something like that.
Look, social media came out in 2000, I think it was 2004 or something, Facebook, 2003. And, through like the first decade, it was like cat videos and sushi pictures, or hey, I'm checking into the boba drink place. Like, it's just dumb. I remember when people used to check into the bagel shops.
I think we're a similar age. I remember in college, well, first of all, we had to have our college email address to sign up. And then people would post like 30 pictures from one party. Dude. What a wild time.
I can't tell you, but I remember talking to somebody who may or may not be my wife, and we were both on sports teams, and like you couldn't. People started doing that. 30 images from one party, and it was like people are jumping off couches, so like whatever, right?
It's
like
not a good idea.
It's not a great idea. And then there was a point when people started realizing that like the coaches were watching the social media and people started actually getting called in. It was like the Facebook police. And again, as an athlete, I was on the rowing team and we had we had early morning practices and we had, they expected us to function in a respectable manner. The rowing team at Cal has a classically a higher GPA than most other athletic teams. We graduate more people. We have very serious degrees. People move on to grad school, not everybody, but a lot of them. And when you started getting called in because you were in a picture with a Solo cup, like, it's not like, it's like, it was a really bad idea, right? Anyway, but like that was it through like the first 10 years of just people checking into the bagel shop and posting pictures of Saturday night and then getting in trouble because they didn't show up to work on Monday. And the boss was like, is it because you were partying on Saturday? Right. But then it also became this great influencer in that you could reduce down communication to like the hammer and sickle thing, right? But we can't really just blame that. Like, we're using social media to convey reductionist communication, but the polarization of the United States politics started coming in like the mid 90s when you saw like in the 80s, if you had like a scatter plot, it was like you had a lot of reds and blues and all over the place. But by the mid to late 90s, it was like people were all and like just a couple in the middle. Like what was it then? Because we like to blame social media, and I think it has a place at the table of blame. But we started seeing polarization well before this.
For sure. And this is, we actually teach a class on polarization in the political science major at Boise State, digging
Can
into
I be a guest speaker? I don't even care. I don't even care what class it is.
We'd love it.
I would love to be a guest speaker. I don't have a degree in political science, but I talk to a lot of politicians. Like, there's that.
No, I think that I would be happy to welcome you as a guest anytime.
Oh my God, I'm so excited.
But we talk a lot about this, and like, you're right. We started to see polarization at the very least in Congress well before we had social media, right? Like these trends were happening before. And so social media, maybe we can say is further contributing or driving or deepening some of it, but it's not the causal factor. And in fact, it's really hard to find like the causal factor and what's driving us to polarize. But there are some things that we know, like there's discussions about changes in, congressional rules and how kind of Congress functioned, and particularly leaders coming in and really expecting more party loyalty that started to demonstrate more that partisan divide. But we also started to see realignment of issues to where, again, the parties started to be more cohesive around ideology. And now I talked earlier about the Democrats maybe a little less cohesive than the Republicans, but they're still like, they're on the left, right? If you look at voters in Congress, like you have a nice little, bifurcated graph of like the Democrats and the Republicans. So there's some changes that for why we might see some elements there, but also in terms of just changes in campaigning that may be driving some of these, like, okay, it's much more effective to be able to run against the other party. Let's dive into some of these elements. There's some that argue campaign finance.
What do you mean? What do you mean?
So like, as television advertising became more common, things like that, which was already common, but as we started to see more professionalization of campaigns, like it's much more, it's hard in a 30-second television ad to get into the nuances of whatever policy you want to pass. So you're like, okay, well, I got to make an argument for myself, or I'm going to attack the other guy, or maybe I'm going to do both. But like now we start to see like some of that element. So, we have changes in how Congress was running. We have the parties realigning. We have like more and more campaign messaging that's diving into some of the like some of this parts. And I want to say this isn't new. This isn't brand new in the night, like once we get into more recent history. And in fact, there are some scholars increasingly argue the time where we had a lot of bipartisanship in Congress was actually unusual, that maybe having more partisan behavior is more common, partly because in like the 60s and 70s, you had the Democrats, where you had the Southern Democrats who were conservative. So they weren't voting in alignment with the Democratic Party all the time, right? And so like you almost had more, almost, some scholars even argue almost three parties operating in a way in Congress for some period of time. But so we have a lot of different factors happening here, as well as there's some that argue that the increased role of money in politics is playing a role. Because what candidate's going to have an easier time fundraising? Well, probably one that is able to appeal to, the research finding sometimes the more ideologically extreme ones are more effective at fundraising money because of the messaging, but also a really active and engaged base that wants to invest, want to put their money in. And so there's some of these ideas that, it made it easier for more extreme candidates to be successful. Well, at the same time, we have so many things happening at the same time, because we also started to have a dwindling number of competitive races in the U.S. House. And the few races that are competitive tend to be the ones that flip back and forth and are the ones that are more likely to have moderates. What that means, and what's been happening, is those moderates lose and then get replaced by more ideologically extreme members. So we have fewer and fewer moderates in Congress, and more that are, depending on how you identify as kind of, they look more, they're more ideal, they're more conservative or more liberal than what we used to have. We're missing some of that middle. Does that make sense?
Right. But then aren't we also missing the functional middle?
Right.
Right. Like that's the problem.
Right.
Like,
exactly.
Like if you want to solve the problem with water and agriculture in Idaho, you're going to need a middle. Like you're going to need somebody who doesn't care. They're like, problems are pragmatic, right? And yeah, we can have political bents to them. It's like, okay, well, this solution to this problem costs more money than this solution, and I'm fiscally responsible. So like, let's go for this. But at the end of the day, it's like, can you solve the water problem, right? Can you solve the housing problem? Can we solve the education problem, right? Like we have these problems, and those things just by the nature of them require people to be pragmatic and not idealistic.
I think that's exactly right. And that is where we get concerned, and why we see in Congress and some state legislatures a lot of gridlock or really partisan policy that then may be moving the state in directions that are not as effective. Because we do know when you bring more perspective to the table for policy making, you tend to get better policy, because now you can craft policy that's going to, like, first of all, like, problems might come up. Oh, what about this? Okay, well, then we need to think about that. But we can maybe craft policy that will meet the needs of more people, or just craft better solutions to these really big problems we have. And in some places, you really need that middle, or as you were talking about, in order to actually come together and pass some of these policies.
I had a conversation recently with somebody who was talking about exactly what you're saying, which is like you'd have a Democratic governor in Idaho and a Republican lieutenant governor, or vice versa, or you just have these tensions. And those tensions and relationships were functionally able to resolve issues. And in one case, somebody was like, listen, I was working with a governor. I'm like, listen, I'm not going to tell anybody we're working together, but we need to work together on this issue. Right. So like, we're not even going to, popularize the idea that we're, meeting in the office every day, but this is a real problem. And if we don't solve this for Idaho, we're going to be in trouble. And this was something decades ago. And it was so interesting to hear that. It's like, that's how they worked out and created a state that is now like the gem of the United States. It's like this incredible place that people want to live. And it wasn't through having one party dominate. At least it wasn't historically. Somebody asked me months ago, they're like, why did you move here for all of the reasons that Idaho is what it is? My answer was, I don't know why Idaho is the way it is. Like, I moved here because Idaho's awesome, and at least it appears awesome. And I think people are decent to each other and we're good people. But like, I don't know how it became like this. And the more I talk to people, the more they're like, that's because we had everyone. Like we had everyone. We were all just some hot mess of like just trying to solve problems and address the things in the state, like real governance, real like, hey, this is a problem for our farmers. This is a problem for our families. This is a problem for our builders. These are the problems we're trying to address. And they were pragmatic and problem oriented.
I think that's right. And we know that states controlled by one party can experience a variety of issues. Competition is good for a reason, right? It puts pressure on our office holders to be accountable to the people and to make sure that they're kind of addressing the problems people care about and also pursuing policies that the general population, it's in alignment with what they want, right? But it also just keeps government functioning a little bit better. And if you lack that and you just have complete one-party governance, there can be some challenges there. The other thing that will happen is that you start to have, maybe you end up having that competition, but it's now within one party as opposed to between the parties. So, I mean, and some argue like, that's fine. Like, that's not a problem. You still have that competition. It's just different. But I think that's going back to our earlier conversation where some people are like, the ballot initiative is an important tool when you have one party government.
In the absence of a ballot initiative, what stops the elected representatives from just, in a one-party state, and I asked because somebody I heard somebody say, hey, we should eliminate the ballot initiative. Like this direct democracy is not a good idea. I'm like, okay, you're like, I wanted to ask you about that. But then I also was referencing what I thought about from Hiram's interview saying like, yeah, but we need the ballot initiative because if we get too, hyperpolarized or whatever, like that's that function of this thing. If we eliminate the ballot initiative in a very strong one-party state, what are potential outcomes?
And I do think that, for the ballot initiative side, it's often used for government reforms or like political reforms. And so that, to your point of a tool that people can use to be like, all right, I don't like what you're doing anymore. We need to change things up. We need to push back. I mean, I think, once you go without a tool like that, some states have, you start to get concerns about the ability to course correct if you're moving too far in one direction and away from what people want. And we can see this in a variety of one-party states, regardless of kind of whichever party's in control, right?
Like?
Well, I mean, California, the legislature has been unpopular for quite some time, right? In Idaho, for this year in the Idaho Public Policy Survey, for the first time, more respondents reported the state moving in the wrong direction as opposed to the right direction.
Interesting.
And then across ideological leanings, it wasn't just like the more left Idahoans being unhappy. It was a variety of perspectives. And so I think that's where if you start having people being like, it's unrepresentative, I'm not, things are not either not happening, we're not addressing issues, or the solution, you're finding solutions for problems that are not, like not the priority, things like that. And that's where elections are really important for holding our leaders accountable. But first you need it to be contested, right? You need multiple candidates to seek the seat. And in a lot of state legislatures, there's not a lot of contestation. Often like a good chunk, maybe a quarter or a third of the legislature is reelected pretty much automatically because they don't have a primary or a general, competition.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
No, keep going.
And so, it's on the voters, but so first we have to have choices. Right. And then second, we have to be willing to not just vote our party line or hold our own party accountable. And that is where it seems like the strength of party is causing some challenges in terms of strength of party, in terms of like how that identity influences behavior.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The identity, like, it's wild to me that the term rhino is so aggressively thrown around and people want to have control over the characterization of being conservative or a true conservative. Like all of these things, people are like running after them, which is so interesting to me because I thought like, my former state was so hot. Like I used to joke around when I was an idiot 18-year-old. Somebody would say something dumb like, I don't like cheeseburgers from McDonald's. I'm like, what are you, racist? That's crazy. And they're like it was just a joke, right? And by the way, I'm Mexican, so I get to say that stuff. Like, but I would just make dumb jokes about like, oh, you're a racist. And it was a funny thing. But then it became like a really serious thing. And it was this weaponization of characterization, right? It's like, oh, because I mean, then we saw George Floyd in 2020 and it was, oh, no, everyone's a racist. I'm like, whoa. Like, you're being serious. Like, what do you mean I'm a racist? Like, I'm not racist. They're like, well, you're a white dude. You're, of course, racist. I'm like, not white. And what do you mean? Like, I have not done anything. My views on people have not changed. I'm like, what are you talking about? And that weaponization of characterization and identity and holding that identity, you can only be a true conservative if you do these things. Or the guy by the name of Peter, who I hope to have on the podcast, he's just a regular citizen who, moved from my former state as well. And he had made a comment on one of my videos saying, if you're voting for Prop 1, you're really just not a real conservative. You're like, there's just no world where you're a real conservative if you're in favor of this. And I reached out and was like, hey, would you come talk to me about that? Because I don't understand that and I want to know. And we are scheduled to, I hope we can keep the interview lined up. But the point is, it's that kind of thing, which is people saying, hey, I refuse to view you as this thing you're reporting to be if you disagree with me on this issue. And it's, again, holding that carrot in front of people. Like, I will only view you and view you and your identity and recognize what you are saying you are if you act in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that simplification was part of it, right? Of just like, oh, you're this or you're this, and not really being able to engage. That a lot of people have more complicated or nuanced views than just like, I'm this or that.
Right.
But then as well, the kind of the trying to police, who is what, who is
right.
conservative or who is a Democrat or these types of things that we see playing out in a lot of even at our state and local level, right? A lot of these sort of debates. And I understand how we get here, but it's also like, this is perhaps not the most productive
right.
sort of way
right.
to be trying to evaluate our different choices.
Right. Jackie, we've talked about a lot of things. I feel like, Professor Kettler.
Jackie's fine. It's Jackie's great.
We've talked about a lot. I feel like this is going to be a longer conversation with a lot of different things. I know it's a working day for you. You got other things. Is there anything we've missed that you want to hit today? By the way, I'd love to have you back again, especially after these elections. Oh my God, after November, come back and we can talk about what's happening in the country. It'd be crazy. But is there anything we've missed today that you want to hit?
Well, first, thanks for having me.
Of course.
I'm very happy to come back. I think these types of conversations are valuable, right? And that coming together, learning from each other, thinking about things in a different perspective. It's really important for us to do. And I really appreciate, and I think that in Idaho, a lot of people really do want to learn. They're eager to engage. And so it's unfortunate that, sometimes our politics is playing out in a way where we're not getting to take full advantage of, I think, a population that really does want more of this. And I do think that, we're going to continue to see a lot of some of this nastiness, this division, things like that going into the election, right? Like, we know, as we've talked about, why some of these attacks are effective. But I also hope that, we can, and I think here in Idaho, we continue to see things working, people engaging with each other, talking
right.
to each other. And so I appreciate venues and forums that are providing people the opportunity to do that.
Well, I'm doing what I can. Me and my dumb little studio. Anyway, thank you for coming in. Thank you for taking the time, and thanks for helping educate kids on politics.
It's been a joy. Idaho students are great, and I'm just glad to be able to do what I get to do. And thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks.